I'm just going to try and grab what I think are some of the real formative events of more than just the state period, because I'm going to try and present a thesis which says 1948 is important, but not nearly as much as you think. So that's what I'm going to try and give a bit of new ways of looking at chronology, which I'm sure you picked up as you're wandering around at Tel Aviv. To try and maybe point to the issues which I think are formative issues on the human side in making what Israel more or less is today. So one way of dividing, just in terms of chronology, is to kind of say you can look at it chronologically, the country up to the 1880s. The 1880s starts Zionism. Zionism begins somewhere in the 1880s, right through to 1948. So we'll try and just pull that apart for a second. Then I want to suggest it's 48 to 67. I'm a great believer. A lot of disagreement to what I'm going to say, that I think it's the one country 48 to 1967. 1967 is important personally because I came, but besides that, everything starts changing in 1967. So I think it's kind of a 3 or 4 maybe way of looking at society. I'm going to deal with the human side. Cut me off at any time you want. Before the 1880s, this country is very traditional, and I'm talking about the country. Both Jewish society is traditional, as is Arab-Palestinian society. It's very much influenced by a whole set of values which immediately in the 1880s comes into major crisis when immigrants, Jewish immigrants, come from the wider world. In the period from the 1880s to 1948, I think there are 4 or 5 major questions which come up in trying to understand the period. One of my courses this year is two courses I'm giving on Zionism and the Yishuv. So I'm trying to, it's an undergraduate program, I'm trying to take undergraduates and say, really, what are the issues between the 1880s and 1948? And every time I give a course like this, I realize how little I'm really saying because there's so much other stuff filled with massive issues. And if I had to write a book on that period, I would actually call it The Story of the Unknown. That means from 1880 to 1948, what you're dealing with is when you move into the here and now of the people, is what is going to happen in 6 months' time, or what is going to happen in a year's time, or what is going to happen in 5 years' time. We're constantly filled with masses of question marks. One of the reasons why that is true then, and it's essentially true today, is that this country, as you know, is based on an unusual phenomenon of totally uncontrolled migration. Immigrants come here. We do not know what Israel is going to be next year. Besides, I'm not talking about the politics or what's going on in the Middle East or whether the government will change, that certainly. But we don't even know what it's going to be like in terms of people. Because by virtue of the law of return, the fact that the Jews return here because they of Jewish background, all the problematics of that definition, you just have no idea what's going to happen. Now, societies in the world, interestingly, are facing the Israeli crisis. Europe has no idea of who the next group of refugees are going to be. So what Israel has lived with all the years, Europe is living with now, and we're going to say how we see how unbelievably problematic it is for Europe to live in a world where immigrants are coming from various parts of the world, and you have actually no planning set up for them. I mean, you know, from Macedonia to Greece, what was happening last week, no one in Europe today has any idea of what to do about it. Not a clue. That's exactly what Israel is all about. Israel has lived through this for over 100 years. And that's what's very interesting about the human side. Non-directed, non-planned migration means that a whole lot of things happen. And here we find within Israeli society 2 very, very clear theses. One is Israel, or Palestine, Jewish Yishuv, did really badly with dealing with the immigrants, and a thesis which I belong to, not necessarily the majority thesis. Wow, the crises and the challenges were so unbelievable. If I'd been around there, I would have done no better than those people. And I think that's a big argument going around the country, whether one looks at it from a modern perspective of, well, we really should have done better. We should have learned more about the people who were coming here. Or my approach, which is, wow, you don't do it. And this is what I'm seeing in Europe. Europe is spending no time asking what it means to be an Eritrean immigrant who suddenly finds her or himself on the border between France and Britain. So this is what this is my basic underlying thesis of what I understand happened until 1948. Tremendous confusion, tremendous amount of unknowns. In the situation of confusion and unknown, what societies tend to do is someone or some groups has to take a stand. And that's what is very much part of the Israeli story and maybe part of the Israeli dilemma. In the period 48, up to 1948, what you essentially have is an unbelievably small number of committed socialists coming from Eastern Europe, Poland, Russia essentially, who looking around what's going on say, I think to themselves, and this is very much if you read Ben Gurion's diaries and others, look, this is going to be chaos unless someone takes control. And I think the development, and it's very interesting, in all revolutionary societies, you actually start off with having a very open revolution. We will try anything, to within a very short period of time, a certain number of people saying, we know everything and we know what's good for everyone. And I think it's true of the Zionist movement. And if we were talking about, I deal with 23 countries, if we were talking about any of the other 23 countries, I could basically say the same idea. It's either chaos, which can be unbelievably creative but frightening, or it's very, very centralized and dominant. So I think the way to understand the human story up to 1948 is to try and look at some of the ideas and often myths and some of the dreams of the group who come here from 1904 to 1923. Just want to spend a little bit of time on them because I think their impact on Israeli society is unbelievable. Firstly, let's try and move away some of the myths. In the period, we're talking about some thousands, not a large number, okay? 25,000 to maybe 35,000. I mean, David Ben Gurion once said that in the second Aliyah, from 1904 to 1914, over 80% left the country. So we don't quite know the numbers. The numbers themselves are not important. What is important is how small the core group was. I think it's an amazing issue of this society, how many of the crucial events in an open society, essentially in many ways a very, very open society, for some people a chaotically open society, were making unbelievable decisions. That core group made a number of vital decisions which carry on in this country for an extended period of time. Firstly, we, the core group, know what's best for everyone. So therefore, it's a very centralized society. Just let's take one small role of Israel. Education, until today, is controlled by a remarkably small number of people who sit in one little building, quite a nice building because it's an old one, in Jerusalem. They literally, from that building, decide until today the central issues of education. And by the way, that goes to just about every other realm as well. What are religious decisions? How are religious decisions made? Also, really, when you come down to it, very small number of people focused in very particular geographical areas, they are making the decisions for the country. This is a society of Eastern European people dealing with the complexity of, firstly, the failure of the First Russian Revolution, 1905, and then secondly, the implications of the Russian Revolution, 1917. Very much influenced by Europe, very, very strongly. You see it permeating all the ideological component of early Israel, and then trying to take that Eastern European socialism and develop a narrative. The narrative is the kibbutz narrative. That's why Neil chose this particular room for us, so we can get the feeling of the kibbutz narrative. It's interesting. You go look at demography. At the highest level, the number of people in this country was more or less in the region of between 8 and 9%. The narrative of the country is that they control the whole place. Very interesting situation. Why? Committed, ideological people who were totally convinced that they were doing the right thing. And because of that, there was a tremendous price that is paid. So that Eastern European core, I think in many, many senses, sets the tone of behavior and what this country should be about in many, many ways right up to the 1970s, okay? Basically an Ashkenazi-influenced Eastern European society is what your group is. Yeah?
Can I ask a clarifying question about the 8 to 9%? Is that 8 to 9% of the people making Aliyah or 8 to 9% of the people in the country?
Of those who make Aliyah.
So what are the other 90% doing?
Okay, no, it's 80. There were the very small numbers. We're talking about 25,000 people here, so it's very, very small numbers. At that same time, and I'll try and make this point be clearer, there is immediately the phenomenon of center and periphery. Israeli society, once again, the languages, we're all in it together. We're all on the football field playing football. Very, very quickly it's clear that there's a center and there's a periphery and there's an in and out. And it's also very, very clear, very early on, and I think it carries on in Israeli society today, there are certain norms and values which allow you to get to the middle. I've used the term for a long, long time of the concept of gatekeepers. So in societies, it's true in America, by the way, it's true wherever you go. I mean, you know, how do you get into a center and how do you stay on the periphery? You have these things called gatekeepers. Gatekeepers are either people or norms or values which are allowing you to get to the center. So Israel, very, very early, even before it's Israel, Palestine, has gatekeepers. There are two groups which are immediately marginalized. The local Arab population, who the core group knows very little about, probably true until today. There's the ultra-Orthodox, many of whom had arrived before the 1980s and were going to carry on coming to this country, who were going to remain very marginalized. And there were the Asian African Jews, the Mizrahi, the Eidot HaMizrach, okay, who come in relatively small numbers, who once again the core know very little about and in many cases don't even see. By the way, there's a very sharp book by journalist Tom Segev, interesting book, 1949, The First Israelis. Very, very interesting book by virtue of the fact that he really puts out there the fact that you're talking about a society where not everyone's getting on and dancing the hora and eating hummus and falafel together. That it's a society which is built by people who are very, very different. Why? Here I think one has to deal with a terminological issue. It's a little bit of a cliche. There is a difference between aliyah and immigration. That's why use of the Hebrew term is important. If you go from Europe to America at the beginning of the 20th century, at least psychologically, you're going to someone else's country and you're going to abide by the rules and regulations of the society. When you talk about the migratory process to Israel, because it has within it a kind of somewhat mythical, psychological idea of I'm coming home, your behavior is going to be very, very different. Coming home means you have very, very high expectations of what you're coming home to, and therefore a higher level of disillusionment. You can follow the story of the migrants being disillusioned in this country, which is remarkably high. Was it worse than the migratory process to the United States or to England or South Africa or anywhere else? Probably not. Probably not much worse, but your level of expectation is much higher. So I want to say that in the earlier period, we're talking about a centralized society. We're talking about a control of a very small group. We're talking about a very ideological period. I spend about probably 15 hours of my undergraduate course just speaking about the early ideologies, because it's multiple ideological concepts. There are 5 different ideological trends that one can talk about. And at the same time, you're talking about a very, very disunited country. After all, who were the people? Who were they? They weren't coming from one part of the world. As time goes by, they come from absolutely every part of the world. And clearly, you never know who the next group's going to be. So just let's try and give some grouping. First aliyah is kind of Romanian, mishmash, semi-religious. Second and third aliyah, ideological, at least the leaders always thought they were. Eastern Europeans, by the way, didn't like each other necessarily because they come from different cities or have different ideologies. Fourth aliyah, Poland in the 1920s. Most Poles never thought they would turn up here, but because of crises in Poland, when Poland was recreated after the First World War, suddenly found they couldn't live there. High level of anti-Semitism, economic crisis in Poland, they come here. Fifth aliyah, the Germans. I want to tell you, although it sounds as if they're all coming from Europe, the idea that they all came from one part of the world is totally incorrect. And one of the fascinating components is that where many people speak about Ashkenazim and Sephardim as being, this is a homogeneous group and this is a homogeneous group, as you get into the studies, you see more and more that the term Ashkenazi is something we use but is meaningless, and the term Sephardi or Mizrahim or Eastern people is also totally meaningless. Between an Iraqi and a Yemenite person, the difference is obviously going to be tremendous. Second World War brings about, I think, what moves us into another mode, and that is the importance of trauma. In my lectures, when I'm got 40 hours to talk about it, I use the word trauma all the time. This is a country based on trauma. It really is. Different kind of traumas. So from 45 onwards, you have people who are traumatized because of Shoah, because of the Holocaust. Multi-levels of trauma. By the way, just recently in Israel, fascinating, last week they were talking more about should second-generation Holocaust survivors, children of Holocaust survivors, receive financial assistance, because they're also traumatized. So it's very interesting. You think. And by the way, when all the Russian Jews started coming in the 1990s, there was a major discussion. You think I'm not traumatized because I spent 5 years in a forest? You're only traumatized if you're in a ghetto or a concentration camp. The traumatization dilemma is unbelievable, both for the Jews and for the Palestinians. Let me just say something about the Palestinians. Palestinians they don't go through Holocaust, that's for sure. But their traumatization is based on a whole lot of other issues. Firstly, they are a society which is as heterogeneous as the Jewish society, although they might all be living in a particular area. Palestine, Israel, Eretz Israel. Within their societies, they are facing unbelievable conflicts between modernizing groups, nationalist groups, and traditional groups, whereas we have the Ben Gurion, they have their Hajj Amin al-Husseini, where we have the centralized concepts, they have their centralized concepts. But the difference is very, very significant. Whereas the Jews are a minority who become a majority, the Palestinians are a majority who become a minority. And I want to tell you that this is a traumatizing moment of history. So where Jews are coming in here, Holocaust survivors, I've spent a lot of time studying the period 45 to 48. Who comes in? How do you get in? What's the impact of being picked up by a British Navy vessel and sent back to Cyprus? I mean, I was personally interested because I used to do a simulation game with summer programs of the Exodus boat arriving in the Holy Land and being picked up by the British. I did the simulation game for about 4 or 5 summers. Very, very interesting. I stopped it, by the way, I think for one number of reasons. One reason was when a guy, one of the participants, actually thought I was really a British officer. I played the British officer on the boat. I have just come to you and I tell you you will not get to Haifa. You know, and they all thought I was British because even my accent isn't British. I mean, Neil would have been better at it than I am. But, you know, they thought I must be British. And this one guy, we up on the kibbutz, and he said, "What are you doing here?" So I said, "I've come to bring your mail." He said, "But you can't because you're a British officer." He was genuinely so confused by the historical events that I realized you have to be very careful about some of the simulation games. Anyway, the point is, I think the interesting point is, that it's a period of tremendous confusion, both for the Jews and for the Palestinians. Remember, when the State of Israel is created and you have a Jewish majority, the Palestinians, who was something like 7, 8, or 900,000, you get different figures, are only 156,000 in 1949. So you've got multiple traumatized groups from November 1947 to January 1949. 1% of the population, of the Jewish population, die. It's a tremendous, tremendous knock to the human being, partly because we must remember that many of these people had just come out of Europe, had just come out of the Shoah. They arrive in this country. They, in some cases, some famous sort of case studies, the famous battle, one famous battle where they'd been here for 2 weeks. They were taught a little bit of Hebrew. They suddenly find themselves fighting. The enemy is no longer the Nazi, but the Arab. You know, some very, very confusing things. We have great literature, some wonderful articles about how insensitive old-timers are to the needs of newcomers. I want to say, I have been amazed how quickly one has to be an old-timer in this country. You can't sit back for 20 years and complain about the establishment, because you very quickly are the establishment in the eyes of someone who's just got off the boat. It has unbelievable implications, by the way. I mean, I just, looking at myself and what happened in my own personal history here, to suddenly realize that when someone was moaning and groaning about what the country isn't, they were looking at me as if I was personally responsible. But I wasn't personally responsible. I was moaning and groaning to someone who's been here just 2 more years longer than me. Let me try and give you one statistic. 1952, the population of the country had doubled from the figure that had been in 1948. The country doubled its population size in just over 3 years. Now, just put this into your American or your Canadian context, and with Canadian-directed migratory point system. I've been to Canada a chunk of times. I'm always interested in who's allowed in and who isn't, and how much space you have, and how many immigrants you really want. I want to tell you, when you double your population in 2 years, and you have this mass migration of the Palestinians, there is such confusion of what's going on. Let me get one more statistic. 1952, 1 out of every 4 Israeli citizens was a Holocaust survivor. You build a country with 1 out of 4 people Holocaust survivors, you'll understand that why weren't 25% of all citizens psychologists? And even then they would have been overworked. Say it cynically, but I actually mean it seriously. I mean, I think we come out, the collective story of Israel is these unbelievably powerful events of history that have been pretty, in almost every person's life. I've got a good Palestinian friend, Arab friend, Mohammed Darashe, who works at an important center here. When I speak to Mohammed about trauma, we were many, many years ago on a conflict resolution team at the Hebrew University. Remember we were talking about how you solve problems in conflicting societies. We had 3 case studies. And it came to be the fact that whatever case study we were talking about trauma, not only in the Middle East, we were talking about Korea and Ireland and the island of Cyprus, okay? We had interesting case studies. But the point I'm making is that when we look at certain countries, talking about people who just constantly don't know what they're coming from, what they should keep from what they've come from, and what they should come to. So this country is formed by people who after 3 years were considered old-timers. Okay, that's really what it is. You came here in 1946. By 1949, you're an old-timer. Immigrants are coming in and then blaming you. Why are you being sent to some distant development town in the south of the country to live there? Why aren't we living in Tel Aviv where we'd like to live? Very, very problematic early period. I believe, by the way, the drama of firstly 45 to 48, post-Holocaust, and then the first 3 or 4 years of Israeli history was so dramatic that we are still carrying on with some of those issues in Israel today. That the anger level has been so high of so many people who came into this country in the early period that I think politically in other realms we're feeling it today. What's Israel of the 1950s? And let's start 1949. Israel of the 1949 starts taking on a different mode. Firstly, clearly, Holocaust survivors. Secondly, and by the way, demography, numbers are sometimes very confusing. You have a group, the Yemenites, come here in 1949, relatively small, something like 50,000 people. Much greater impact on the cultural development of the country than a small group of 50,000 would ever make one believe, okay? Very isolated group, called Sephardim or Mizrahim. But when you go into Yemenite society, you find, wow, they're very, very different from the other Sephardim or Mizrahim. Come here, get kind of involved in agricultural programs. They had some very, very tragic events that happened to them. Just so we just understand the human side. Ashkenaz cases, I don't know how many, cases of an Ashkenazi family which had lost, they had lost their children in the Shoah, come here, see a Yemenite child in a hospital, look at the Yemenite child's parents, and they're looking as if they're about to die. They'd walked through parts of Yemen, pick up the child and adopt the child, and about 30 years later, it's found out. So you're talking about stuff that's going on. So who's to blame? I put no blame in my analysis of Israeli society because it's very hard to put oneself into these situations. So you have the Yemenites coming in, culturally powerful, inwardly looking, and for very interesting reasons. If you talk about status, which is a big issue when you talk about human beings, Yemenites for a long time a high status group. And the question is, for when one does the study, why? 1950s, Iraqis. Now, the image of Eastern Europe, of Middle Eastern Jews not being well educated and everything is blown out of the window when you have immigrants coming from Iraq in 1950, 51, from Baghdad. There's no more creme de la creme of the Jewish world than the Jews who come from Baghdad in 1951. The Ashkenazim don't know it, by the way. Sometimes you don't think, because you don't want to know. I don't want to know everything that's going on in this country. I don't want to know everything that's going on in the world. Do I really want to know what's going on with the migrants of Europe at the moment? I can hardly deal with our migrants over here. So this blocking off of not knowing, it's not because these were bad people, But there were people who themselves were trying to build, and therefore there was the development of very, very strong stereotypes. Stereotypes go every direction. If any of you are interested in studying stereotypes, I would say the first thing you have to do is gather jokes. I spend fortunes of my time, wherever I go. 8 hours time, I'll be in Prague. Okay? So I'll go meet some friends in Prague. So what am I going to do for lunch? First thing, tell me a good Czech joke that I haven't heard. Unfortunately, I was there 2 months ago, so I probably know all the jokes. But why do I say that? Because built into the understanding of Israel is not just people saying, this is what happened, but rather understanding what were the unstated components of society. And I'm concerned with time, but I'm just going to tell you one joke, but there are masses of them. Let me tell a joke about the Germans, because normally you tell about the others. So there's a joke that a guy is going up on a train to Naharia, up in the north of the country, and he's a very, very yucky, very, very German kind of guy, and he gets on the train and he sits with his back to the engine, and when he arrives in Naharia, he gets off and he's got a terrible pain. So his family said, "What happened?" He said, "I was so uncomfortable with my back to the engine." So they said, "Why didn't you ask the people sitting opposite of you if you could change places?" And the guy said, "No one was sitting opposite me." Now, thanks for laughing. Almost no Israeli jokes are funny. But I want to tell you, Israeli jokes are profound. They are unbelievably profound. One of my classes is Modern Israel. And when I do the sociological section, I tell about 10 different jokes, because each of them says so much more than the society really wants to say. So jokes in the 1950s are powerful, all very ethnic, okay? Almost none of them friendly. When does the society change? 1967. 1967 is a very, very dramatic moment of Israeli history, because until then, just about every migrant group had been looked down on by the core groups. Whoever is the core group at a certain time looks at the migrants. We got some wonderful plays on how each group looking down on the other. I believe that 1967 is important, not only because of the Six-Day War, and that's a massive event. Everything that's tied up with Israel today is Israel with the territories, Israel without the territories, all the political stuff, all the religious stuff, all clearly developed very significantly in 1967. But the other is, I believe, and once again, ego comes into it, I believe that the Anglo-Saxons, that very strange term, because who does it mean, but we know what it means. Kind of the Western, mainly English speakers, but the French should join in as well, So it's that kind of crowd. I believe that 1967 was the first moment where immigrants come into this country were wanted, really wanted. They wanted what the Anglos brought at the time of the Six-Day War. The Six-Day War brought not only numbers, by the way. One should never count just numbers. One must start counting impact. 1967 to me is important because I think it's the move away from the old Israel to the new Israel. People often take the 1977 election, when you change governments, as the crucial one. I see 1967 as the crucial moment. Israel moves from being its old, socialist, collective, core-dominated society to a new kind of economy, a laissez-faire economy, with a totally different attempt, I don't know if it succeeded, to de-tribalize Israeli society. The Israeli president, good guy, who spoke a little while ago about the tribes of Israel. Very, very interesting language. By the way, in anthropology, sociology, the word tribes become a word that you don't like using so much. but I think it's an important word because I think it means it's not just ethnic identity. I think there is something about the tribe. The tribe, as I use it, I mean, I taught this stuff on Africa for many years. The tribe is when your ultimate loyalty is to your group. 1967 starts to change this thing of loyalties. Loyalties move out. By the way, it's also influenced by the power of the second generation. First generation, I'm a first generation. I mean, our kids can't get over the fact that I've been here so many years. And they say, Dad, you still don't get it. And they say it in a very condescending way, just so I understand that I really don't get it. Why? What don't I get? Because you are just one of those people who come from that please and thank you Anglo-Saxon world, and it means absolutely nothing. Get tough. Get tough, they say to me. I don't think they're too tough, and their kids say to them, you know, you're not the kind of people we wanted as parents. But that's another story. 67 is the crucial period. 67 opens the society. 67 breaks down the core groups. Very interesting. From 67, although there were some tough moments afterwards, 67 changes the Ashkenazi Sephardi business. If you're interested, any of you interested in voting trends, by the way, it's coming out very, very strongly that the concept of the Mizrahi middle class, which wasn't even recognized when it existed, is just there. We live in a place called Even Yehuda, not far from Netanya. We just moved there 6 months ago. It's just unbelievable to look around our street and to realize that today I have no tools to really understand where people come from. And I'm going to stop in 10 minutes, which will be good. 10, okay? I'm going to stop in 10 minutes, but I'm just going to, sorry? No consciousness of where people really come from. What is their ethnicity? And I just want to give you one little case study of what I used to do at university, which was for me the way of really understanding it. Over a period of about 30 years, I used to, at a certain time, ask my students, Tel Aviv students, Israeli students, the following question. How many of you are Ashkenazim? And in the early years, it was about 3/4 of the class. By the way, I was always connected with Middle East studies, so we had people from Middle Eastern countries because they a bit of Arabic in their family background, so it was a bit higher maybe than in philosophy department. But 2/3 or something like that, 3/4, always put up their hands, Ashkenazi. Who I said, who is? Sfaradim, who are Dota Mizrach. Probably something in the region of about 1/4. Now, why did I ask that question? Because I wanted to see if this was a consistent component of Israeli society. 20 years later, the answer to my question was, how many of you are from Ashkenazi backgrounds? And what I'm telling you is literally the truth. The hands were like this. And what they're saying? Moshe, ani Ashkenazi or lo? Yeshli Saba, I've got a grandfather who's from Iraq. Mani. And then the discussion in class was, More, teacher, tell us, who am I? It was unbelievable. Just seeing the difference between the hand, where people were so aware of their identity, to this question. And just saying it, and I see it all the way along in Israeli society. And we have to be very careful. How long do we retain traditional, outdated languages when the realities are really not there anymore? Okay? Very, very important question. So, just to try and sum up. As I say, from the 1967, things change. Anglo-Saxons bring in a different way of understanding the world. I remember arriving here, and the feeling, I mean, maybe I felt it, maybe no one intended it. I felt I was really wanted here. Firstly, I arrived one day before the Six-Day War. So when anyone said, when did you arrive? You said, I arrived one day before the Six-Day War. I came to fight. What do you mean came to fight? I picked tomatoes for the week of the war. But it was very interesting. The sense that I had as a student at Hebrew University of people really happy that I came here. It was amazing. They might have insulted me behind my back, but it was very interesting. Then you have quickly 3 other human groups that come in. Firstly, the Ethiopians. Big, big problem. For the society, not for them as well. The society spend no time learning about them. How do I know? Because the Israeli army used to ask me to come and tell the Israeli army officers about, I've got those 3 Ethiopian soldiers, and they're talking to me in a way I don't understand. What do I do about it? The army, by the way, I'll say in their favor, the army was caring about it. I was called up often enough to do some of the stuff I'm doing here, obviously much more narrow and much more focused, in terms of trying to get a handle on who these Ethiopian immigrants are. How do we know we followed up? Any daily newspaper, Hebrew or English, read anything you want, of the last 3 months will show that we in Israel didn't make, there were some 101 efforts, and it's difficult. And it's now in the minds of Israelis. We have to understand that Israelis are not studying anthropology. Israelis are asking where they can get a better deal in the local supermarket. This color thing, where you don't know where someone is an Ethiopian Jew or where they're an immigrant from Eritrea. I want to say this thing that's happening because of this other immigrant, the refugee, asylum seekers, Ethiopian, Eritrean immigration, has made what is anyway a very, very difficult issue harder in the minds of the people who just go into the supermarket and seeing some black people walking around. Now, it's hard to believe that anything in this country is politically incorrect. It's kind of hard to believe that that exists. But there is a kind of slowly developing political incorrectness, and you don't go up to one of these people and say, are you one of us or are you one of them from Eritrea? But I tell you, in the eyes of the people, it's there. Jews, non-Jews, citizens of the country, illegals, very, very awkward at this moment. Yeah.
Can you just elaborate on why the confusion between the Eritrean refugees and the Ethiopian
Jews, because they
complicated and makes the situation?
Because if it's just Ethiopian Jews, they're yours. They're part of this new tribal, supra-tribal society which you're trying to create. If they're the Eritrean immigrants, asylum seekers, 3 or 4 words, whichever you want to use, they don't belong here. And therefore, even as we moved over from old tribalism, we still got expanded particularism. So that's what it is. Now, if they're part of your extended super tribe, you have levels of responsibility for them. If they just others, you don't. It's a very, very profound issue. Second group were the Russians. No one ever knew what Gorbachev and Yeltsin and that crowd would do over there in the 1980s. No one ever knew that 1989, 1990 would open up Eastern Europe, the Iron Curtain countries. No one ever thought that 1 million Russian speakers would arrive in this country. And no one had any idea of what it was to be an upwardly mobile Muscovite Jew who suddenly leaves Moscow and comes here, because no one's really spoken to the Israeli population about what Moscow is. Now, if any of you been to Moscow, it's a pretty withered kind of city. So once again, we had this influx of almost 1 million people. Very interesting, very, very major debate. At a certain time, they were 1 out of 5. Every Israeli citizen was a new immigrant from the former Soviet Union, who in most cases not all, had neither of the two requirements of belonging to the extended family, knew very little about Judaism, sometimes absolutely nothing, and had very little of this old-time mythical Zionism, which was good to have when Neil and people like myself came out of youth movements with all the challenges that brought, but we had it. Somehow within our essence it was. So here was a different group, a mass group. And not only was it a mass group, very quickly they said, we don't like your food, so we're going to open non-kosher butcheries in Beit Shemesh, which rather shocked the local population. Or we've got enough of our own people to have our own Russian-speaking TV. And not only that, we are going to be such hard workers that before you know what, you're going to have Russian speakers in the Habima Theater, pretty clear with the Russian accents, but we're going to be in a Hebrew-speaking theater, and we are going to produce a whole lot of magazines and newspapers. Very, very interesting. And because they came from their background, they were going to basically say to Israeli society, we don't buy your stuff. Once again, I've got 2 minutes. Little story. Going on a cab from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, sitting next to a Russian woman, one of those 10-seater things, speaking to her. This is towards the end of the 1990s. I say to this person, how's life? I speak to a lot of people. Very few people speak to me. Very few people answer me. I'm always chatting with someone, but they're normally not interested. It doesn't matter. So I'm speaking to this woman, and I said, no, ma shlomech? How are you? Lotov, no good. I said, why no good? So I come from the thing that I think people should be basically happy. So have you got an apartment? Yes, I've got an apartment. Have you got friends? Yes, I've got friends. Have you got some family members? Yes, I've got family members. So I'm saying, lady, you should be happy. I mean, this is what Israelis want. An apartment, friends, and some sort of family relationship. What is going on? Niet circus. No circus in Israel. I was shocked. We are never going to have a good circus, and we're never going to have the Bolshoi ballet. If she said Bolshoi ballet group, I would understand. I want to tell you, this is their real world. You see, this is coming on Aliyah, not just a migrant. They want, the Muscovite wants Moscow, Bolshoi ballet, 10 minutes from where we are. And unfortunately, we've got great dancing groups, fabulous, but not quite the Bolshoi, okay? And the last group, and this I end, because I'm pretty good on that.
Yeah,
You try, gosh.
So
Okay, I've really tried. The last group are the Frenchos. French, different. The French have got a very interesting migratory trend. The grandparents stick around there and often send their children and grandchildren. The plan is that if things get better in France, which I've been in France a few times the last few years, not a high level of belief that things are going to work out well for the Jews there. But if they do, then children, grandchildren can still come back and live back there in Paris. I mean, with all due respect, Paris is quite an impressive place. I like Tel Aviv also, but not quite the same. If things get bad, granddad and grandmom move here. Now, this summer, we live near Netanya. If someone hadn't told me that the actual national language of Israel is Hebrew, I would have said it was French. They are coming in their droves. Now, they're not only coming because this is a cool summer, except this summer, which is ghastly, okay? This isn't just because they're coming to a summer place, not only because here they can get kosher food. They don't have to look around too many blocks to find it. Not only because they like the way that the Netanya people walk on the streets, it's because in the back of their mind, they are asking the big question, is where we are coming? And I end with the French because it goes back to what I said at the beginning. Everything that I've really tried to say has been based on unknowns. Don't know who's coming. They don't know they're coming. The French don't know if they're coming for a long time or a short time. The unstated, the unknowns, the lack of clarity of Israeli society seem to be what it's really all about. Last, very, very personal comment, 2 minutes over time. It is such a fascinating country, this, but so darn exhausting. So I'm going now for 5 days to Prague, going to a seminar and stuff like that. It's so nice to be there. No one asks difficult questions. People are just living, okay? I'm going to give a presentation on crises in the Middle East, which everyone will love, because the Czech Republic is kind of a nice academic question. When I talk about crises in the Middle East, excuse the expression, I'm scared shit, because ISIS isn't too far away. And I'm living in what I'm living in here. So something which is not the topic, but I always say it has to be there as well in one's mind. Living in Israel, all these issues, everything. But let us not for 1 second, even though this might be the focus of everything we do, let us for not 1 second remember that our neighbors are not the French or the Germans and the Danes, but our neighbors are who they are. And I think that adds not only to all the things we talk about, I've tried to talk about, but also the neighborhood has within it some very, very important questions to deal with as well. So we're dealing inwardly and outwardly all the time. We're dealing with the citizens of Israel divided between their subgroups, as well as the Israeli relationship to the broader diaspora. Lots of in-outs, which I think is what I've basically been trying to say. Thank you.
Thanks so much for
Good. Thank you.